Hello and welcome to Identirati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and this is episode 26 on shared signals and CAEP. We have with us Shane Miel from Cisco, right?
Yes.
And Mike Kaiser from SailPoint. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And actually, before we dive into it, maybe I can ask for some quick intros how you got here. Shane, how do you get into CAEP and shared signals of all things?
Yeah, sure. So let's see. Early in my career, I specialized in data science, doing a lot of machine learning stuff, mostly for education technology companies. I'm fairly new to the security space, to be honest. But one of the people that I worked with at one of my companies joined Duo, and she convinced me to come over. Told me a lot about how great the culture was there, and so I joined, and I've been quickly learning about the security space. And one of my first projects was, and really the main thing that I work on at Duo is continuous trusted access. So figuring out what can we do after the point of authentication to help keep our users safe. And Duo has all these great tools for making sure we know who the user is at that moment of authentication, making sure that they're well protected then. But then we don't have anything that we can do after that. So we were thinking, okay, well, what can we do? How do we enforce anything after the point of authentication? And one of the options, there are a number of options, and I can talk about them on the show if you want, but one of the options is shared signals. So I started digging into that, joined the working group to try to understand more about it. We created a shared signals guide to try to help explain about it. And then I became one of the working group co-chairs.
Well, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but before we dive into the actual content, Mike Kaiser, the other Austin guy with a hat, and normally cool sneakers too. So tell us a little bit about your background as an Identirati before we dive into shared signals.
Sure. Sneakers unpictured in this podcast for various reasons. So my background, I worked for IBM for like 16 years, doing solution architecture, writing, doing a little bit of everything. And early on, I started to notice the standards work that was going on. And I really felt attracted to that in general, because to a large degree, I think I've always been this is a fairly recent realization. It's going to sound moronic, but it's fairly recent. I realized that I'm kind of addicted to idealism and or truth. I started out as astrophysics in university, and then later on I got a theology degree, and standards just kind of follows right in line with that, right? Because there are always incentives in play, like how do you make money as an organization if you implement this standard? But there's also a community there that is trying to say, well, what's the ideal? What's the right thing to do for security or for identity or for privacy, whatever it is, and how can we make that a reality, right? It's always a tension, but I found that attractive. So in my career, I've kind of moved in that direction. The shared signals specifically, or the shared signals framework, I actually heard a tool give a talk at the Internet Identity Workshop out in Mountain View at, yes, the Computer History Museum, which sounds like the lamest setup for anything ever, but it's entirely appropriate. A lot of the major ideas for standards and identity and security have come out of that. And I was there when he first
on the live stream.
Oh, well, there you go. And so a tool got up, and booked up, a whiteboard and said, hey, here's this problem that no one's doing anything about. And from the beginning, I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so I was in the orbit for a while, and then finally got a little bit more involved over time. So it's been great.
So let's dive back into it. Shane, you said something interesting, because you said, well, Duo is really an authentication service, really fundamentally. But you said you're trying to figure out how can we get more signals after the authentication event. That seems kind of contrary to everything Duo is about, because what how does Duo get any information after that? I understand why they might be interested, but it seems sort of contradictory to what Duo does.
Well, there are a lot of ways that we might get signals that um, that could still be at the time of authentication. Right? You authenticate into one application, then later on you authenticate to another application. So that second authentication is a signal that is mid-session for the first authentication that you did. That's sort of your basic answer. But we also have we have our own SSO and an IDP platform. And with our ties to Cisco, there are a lot of tools that we have access to now that give us real-time information about what's going on. Plus, with shared signals, the opportunity to partner with other companies who are detecting things in real time and are interested in sending those signals to us to help cut off the sessions is made available.
This might sound ridiculous, but people forget about the network. They forget that their packets are traveling on this thing, on these hubs and routers and everything. And I could see a lot of interesting information, especially with better ML and AI techniques about being able to figure out stuff that's going on in the network and maybe factor that up. So Mike, SailPoint, I think of SailPoint in the governance identity management space. And that's not normally runtime stuff. So what was the interest of SailPoint in this particular problem or challenge?
Sure. I think it's a couple of things, right? SailPoint and governance vendors like SailPoint are in a kind of a unique spot in terms of seeing and touching everything kind of all at once, right? The idea is you see all the identity is doing, and you're right. Historically, it's been kind of a little bit of an admin time focus, right? I think those lines are starting to blur a little bit. I think that giving people classically, what's the classic equation? Giving people the right access, the right people the right access at the right time, right? That time factor has often been neglected. So, the other thing that SailPoint has always had perspective of is trying to play well with others in general, right? For example, if we know that some identity should not be trusted, what are we going to do for an organization? We're going to suspend that identity. That's great. But if you're logged in to some other facility and you have a token with a time to live, until that thing expires, you can do whatever you want, right? That's not playing a team sport. That's me doing what I want to do, right? And in our industry for a long time, organizations, vendors in particular, have been like, I'm not going to tell you anything because I want to be the control for everything. And I don't think that's realistic going forward. I'd much rather have these entities sharing information, saying, I know this, you need to know this, tell me what you know. And then each of those actors can play together on behalf of an enterprise or organization, making educated decisions within their sphere of control, right? So again, it goes back to kind of an idealism in terms of if I am running identity, running security for an enterprise, what do I want to happen? I want Duo and Cisco and SailPoint and everybody else to tell each other about stuff and work together, not run through one offensive thing. So I think it's a combination of those two factors, right? That yes, admin time, but admin time's bleeding over into the closer and closer to real time in terms of, well, should they still have this access? If I can, with zero trust and all those kinds of marketing terms to some degree, with zero standing privilege concepts, right? I don't really want to provision an entitlement and let you have it forever. I'd rather just scope it to when you need it or when you're entitled to it. So this kind of shared signaling, communicating back and forth allows me to do that. And then again, play well with others. Everything, it all has to be a team sport if it's really going to work and realize some of those ideals.
It sounds like the nature of governance is sort of expanding, where it includes more than just, certifying the roles of a person, but the governance is now including more types of real-time issues that companies might want to say, well, if this happens, maybe we should do something like this.
Yeah, the government, the enterprise is defining a policy, right? Would they rather have that policy be checked once and then again next month? Or would they rather be saying, is the policy still right? Hey, is the policy still right? Hey, is the policy, should they still have access, right? It's more of a it's in the name, right? Continuous kind of checking to make sure it's there. Now, that again, for that to work, I'm not saying SailPoint is going to do your real-time gatekeeping next week, right? That's not what I'm saying either. I'm saying that SailPoint has a role to play, and it has to realize that it has information that people like Duo or Cisco or whoever else can use to do their job better, right?
So let's take a step back because not all of our audience might be familiar with shared signals or CAEP. Maybe Shane, you could walk us through the difference between these two specs or how they relate to one another at both specs at the OpenID Foundation, right?
Absolutely, yes. Both specs are OpenID. Shared signals is a standard way to send and receive events between two entities. So you think about it like the transport mechanism. You have a transmitter and a receiver, and it defines the way that the receiver talks to the transmitter and sets up a stream, and can add subjects to the stream and can request certain events on the stream, and then can either poll for events or the transmitter can push those events to the receiver. That's all the shared signals framework spec. The events themselves can really be anything, anything that's well defined that you can point to and say this is where the schema for this event is. But we have a couple of blessed set of events. One of those is the CAEP set of events, continuous access and evaluation profile. And so these are events that are about the session, about the user's session. If the transmitter entity revokes a session, they might want to alert the receiver that that has happened. If they notice an assurance level change in credentials, they might want to alert the receiver about that. So that's CAEP. There's also RISC, R-I-S-C. I don't know off the top of my head what that acronym stands for. Those are about the account mostly. So you have some credential compromise, you have some account creation type events. And then we have some other things that are starting to roll in, like the SCIM events that Mike can certainly talk about. And like I said, you can also plug other standardized events into the system if you want.
Right. And the one that I think is sort of telling is there's a logout event.
Yeah.
And logout has been one of the unsolvable problems of federated identity. Maybe you could talk a little bit about why CAEP or shared signals might be a good fit for logout.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the event in question is the session revoked event. And the thing about these CAEP and RISC events is that we want them to be non-prescriptive. That is, the transmitter says, hey, this thing happened, right? Or I saw this happen. It's not saying, hey, thou shalt do something. Because what we found is that receivers, the entities that are receiving these messages, they don't want to be told what to do. And I think, honestly, that's a lot of why maybe the back channel logout for OIDC has not taken off as well as it might otherwise have. So these session revoked messages are someone saying, hey, I revoked the session, just letting you know, do what you want with that information.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, up until 2 minutes ago, I didn't know there were SCIM events. is there a SCIM profile? And why would other domains need to know about? Because we're not talking about within your domain, we're talking about between domains when we talk about an OpenID standard. So why would interdomain we need to communicate maybe SCIM events?
Well, a couple of things. One, as Shane describes, the semantic meaning of these events varies depending on who you're talking to. And Shane can argue with me here. I'm going to get to your SCIM events question here in just a minute, Mike.
Okay.
that I think it's important to people forget that while these offerings or solutions have probably some default behavior, the enterprise, the organization owns both products and can kind of say, hey, you're going to tell these guys or these people about what you know. And then when you get this message, I want you to do X, Y, and Z. And that X, Y, and Z might look really different depending on the organization, right? And so again, they're all playing a team sport. So a session revoked event in the interop we did at Gartner in February meant very different things depending on who is issuing it and who is receiving it. The action was different. So I expect the enterprise to have the owner constituency of both of all these have a say. Skim events. The reason why it's coming about is because there's still different domains within enterprises, right? If you think about Skim and what the need was originally, it was to communicate information about accounts and entitlements and that kind of thing from, a central location or one location to another, one application, one offering, one identity base to another. Whether that's cross-domain, we can talk about what that is or is not, but that need still exists. Now, in a skim-based world, sometimes these are very large things that are being sent across the wire, large synchronizations done historically once a day, once a week, depending on what it is, right? As applications and as these identity repositories or locations of identity move closer and closer to event time or to event-based architectures, there are certain times when I want attributes changed closer to real time in an event-based approach rather than let me shove everybody over all 1,000 records at a time. That takes time, right? So there may be applications where I want Shane to be able to log in. Great. I could create an event, use a skim event to go and create his account. But then as he changes, maybe there is an attribute that changes that someone knows about, whether it's SailPoint or not. That skim event gets sent out. Now that attribute has changed when that policy gets evaluated to access that next resource, or the skim event gets sent out and then we send another event gets sent out saying, hey, you might want to refresh your token or check your claims or whatever else. Now you can update in near real time and now his access can change over time, right? So that's a powerful concept. Now, are you going to use skim events for everything? No, not in the near future, right? Because not everything needs to be that close to real time per se, right? There are side benefits as well for skim events because when the original skim was laid out originally in the IETF, it's a slightly different world. I would say there are some privacy considerations that are baked in to skim events where you don't have to share quite as much information. And there's some other scenarios there that can benefit. Those are developing over time. That skim events draft is in the skim working group in IETF. So it's not OpenID, but it's adjacent surrounding and it's agnostic, right? So the way it's being written and set up is saying, look, here's a skim event. Shockingly, it looks a lot like an event, an SET, a secure event token that would work with push or pull, which is what underlies shared signals framework, right? And so you can use it with shared signals. Do you have to? No. You could use any method to share that security event token, but the way that I think it's going to turn out is going to be de facto largely on shared signals framework. Because if you already have that and you're already doing CAEP and you're already doing risk events, why wouldn't you tack on skim events as well where it makes sense for not for free, but you already have the transport layer. So it just makes it an easier step forward.
Right.
That was a lot of words.
So
Does that make sense?
I'll add a link to the skim events draft in the wiki page. There's a wiki page for each episode. So Shane, what about on the topology side? In my head, Glue is a software vendor in the IDP space. So I'm wondering, like, who sends these? Who's a transmitter and who's a receiver typically? And is this an ask on IDP vendors? And then do we need new systems? I was never receiving events before. as an IDP, where do we expect the receivers to process this information? So can you talk a little bit about what type of topology and infrastructure you see this requiring in the future?
Sure. I can talk about maybe what we've seen starting to develop among the people that have been implementing this, which is that a lot of the IDP players are setting themselves up as transmitters. They have a vested interest in saying, okay, I want to, say that a user has been logged out, and I would like all of the applications that are using me as the source of truth to also do that logout action. So in that world, the IDP is the transmitter, and the relying parties are all receivers. But there's no real requirement that that's how it gets set up. There's easy arguments to say that an entity could be both a receiver and a transmitter. You take a company like Signal, where they're trying to be a hub of these events. They're receiving events and then rebroadcasting them out. That might be a thing that happens to any of our companies, where you get an event, you do something with it, you add to it, or you get enough events that it triggers a threshold that causes another event, and you want to send that out. I think anywhere that you have an ITDR system set up, you're probably going to want to be a receiver of events, and likely also a transmitter of events. Your question about, you said that glue is not typically
I'd just like to define the acronym. So when you said, are you saying basically an intrusion detection system would maybe be able to make use of these events in its, was that the system you mentioned?
ITDR, identity threat detection and response.
Yes.
Yeah. Anybody that's collecting information about these events that are happening in the identity space of their users, and then often they wind up with a dashboard of here are the events that have happened, here are some charts, or the responses, alert the administrator and do something about this. So it helps put a tool likes to say that it helps put the R in response, because we could send that event to another entity that could actually take an action. You could maybe send it to a Cisco who's, if you're set up on the VPN, we could cut off the VPN access, that kind of thing.
Right. So Mike, I'm going to put you on the spot here and say, I know that this would be useful for like Google and Yahoo and the big, let's say, large consumer IDPs, Microsoft, and because they might say, well, an account takeover happened on Google, I maybe should let a related account I know on, let's say the person also has a Yahoo address registered. I should let Yahoo know that their underlying address has been compromised. So, and I've heard about adoption among sort of the big tier 1 IDPs, but do you know, what does adoption look like here? And are we worried about the in the federated identity world, we had a lot of IDPs, but not enough relying parties. So it's like your infrastructure is only as useful as the people who can consume it. Do we see any similar challenges there with adoption outside of the big IDPs?
That's funny you say it that way, because that's one of my favorite phrases these days when I'm explaining incentives, especially, is to say that everybody wants to be the IDP, right? Which is kind of the less than ideal scenario, right? Only because if you're actually sharing information, you're all working together, it's better. I think that some of these large organizations supporting it will help advance the standard. Correct me if I'm wrong, Shane. I think Google has some form of this in Gmail or
they support
some such.
Yeah,
there we go. And so that helps advance the ball. I think that once you have enough weight behind it, then you kind of have to adopt it. Like Skim, right? Skim, while it's not perfect, it's advancing slowly but surely and hasn't died in a dumpster fire like SPML did. May it rest in peace. But part of that is adoption, right? But I think, again, there are benefits even to being a receiver. Like picture someone who you wouldn't think of, like a government, like SailPoint, for instance, right? us receiving information, well, that's helpful because now we can say, look, Shane did some sketchy things. And I don't know, I may even not even know exactly what Shane did, but maybe his sessions got revoked, or that there's some whatever the event is that comes in. The first time I get that, I may be like, it's fine, right? But if I get like 10 events about Shane in half an hour, well, now I'm gonna start alerting my governance team that, hey, this person is his risk level, however I estimate it, within sale, wherever else it is, my risk level for that person that I have, that I'm calculating, is going to go up. And eventually it's going to hit some threshold where now I take action, not because this other sender event told me to, but I'm pooling information. I've got information from other sources that I trust, which is really important, right? We can talk about that in a minute. But as long as I trust that information, now I'm going to have to go do something, right? Because now Shane's too much is going on with Shane for me to ignore it. And now I've got to suspend his account if I'm governance, or I need to nuke him off his MFA clearance that he has. If I'm doing wherever it is, whatever I control, I'm going to make him re-authenticate. I'm going to make him go through a certification process. I'm going to check his location. I'm going to send people to his house and make him show me his ID. Whatever extreme measure I want to do, that I can do that's convenient and to protect the organization, right? So
as the standards guy, I'm going to let you off the hook and say, yeah, that would be nice. But in order for any of this goodness to really happen, we need our application developers to actually be able to use real-time information and real-time security. So Shane, I'll sort of maybe give you the chance to be the skeptic. What are some of the challenges that you see in actually rolling this out? And getting, even if you have an actionable event, let's say we decide user foobar should be revoked, what are some of the challenges that we need, that we have in the enterprise especially, to actually act on that information?
Okay, so before I become a skeptic, let me leave my rose-tinted glasses on for one and answer your last question, which is that the value in this for the smaller companies, smaller organizations, is I'm a huge fan of specialization, and I think shared signals gives companies an opportunity to specialize. A company can be really good at detecting threats and doesn't have to be good at also managing identities and revoking sessions. It allows us to spread those abilities out among different companies in the identity fabric. Okay, rose tinted glasses off. What is challenging about adopting this? I honestly, the biggest challenge right now is like the bootstrap challenge. We're seeing people say, "Oh yeah, I'll do that," but there's not enough groundswell yet. Not enough other people doing this for us to put resources into it, and so it gets hard to get that first move happening, that first wave. So that's a lot of what we're trying to do is we're publicizing this. We're saying, okay, look, these people are doing it. These people are doing it. And here's where the value is. Technically, like from the technical side of adopting it, it's actually fairly simple. Especially to be a receiver is incredibly simple. You are just hosting an endpoint or polling an endpoint and doing something with events that come in. A lot of companies have event-based processing. You don't need to maintain some large infrastructure of some Kafka infrastructure or anything like that. You're just getting them over regular HTTP endpoint.
Yeah. So, well, getting the data is easy, but making that data into actionable information, I think, is not easy. And I don't know any enterprises that actually, they don't generally do this today. So there needs to be some type of, and maybe that's what Signal.ai, the Signal company does. Maybe they're taking this data and making it into information, but just getting the data by itself is not really going to help you. So
I'm not sure I agree with that. The data is incredibly valuable. Think about some of the things that we're doing at Duo, where our risk-based authentication is looking for signs of malfeasance and changing the way that the user does authentication based on those kind of signals. So as we receive those signals, it can help us trigger those thresholds that say, okay, yeah, this is severe enough that you need to do a more intense form of authentication, like what Mike was saying in his rant about sending people to my house.
Yeah, so an event like a logout event, I don't need 8 of those. I only need 1 of those.
So, okay, so I think you're focusing on the session revoked event, and that is a particularly challenging one, right? It is one that if you're a relying party, then you have a pretty good story to tell for how to handle a session revoked event. You invalidate the cookie that you've granted for the session. You wait for it to show up, and you say, "Oh, okay, no, that's no good. You have to log back in." If you're an IDP, SSO provider, you can log out the SSO session. You can log out that authentication. It's not as real time, but the next time the user tries to jump from one application to the next,
yeah,
they'll notice
it. To re-authenticate. Yeah.
It does imply that you have some kind of token that is maintaining that state of the session that's being held by the user. I think almost all companies are doing that, and that you can look for that token and say, okay, yeah, no good, or at least identify the user and say, yeah, no good, you got to log back in.
Mike, do you see any? So how do we get? So if we can share this information, I still see a missing piece in the authorization layer where we're able to express these policies in English, but then to actually get the authorization, I believe we're actually missing this shared authorization infrastructure where we could make policies that say, okay, if you see an assurance level change event, then you should do this. Like I don't know. Is maybe the reason that we're struggling to get adoption of CAEP because we really need this authorization layer, the centralized authorization layer first to be able to make use of these events?
Well, first off, that's probably a different live podcast talking about authorization policy.
We have many of those scheduled. Don't worry.
Right. So I think even before you get to needing to talk about authorization policy, though, I was on a call with a customer a while back, year and a half ago, and there were multiple major vendors on this call, right? And every one of them got on. I went last, so I was fortunate, or whatever. Every one of them got on and said, "We have a risk score for you, and our risk score will solve all your problems," right? At the end of the call, the CISO was like, "You have a risk score, you have a risk score, you have a risk score. Which one should I trust?" And my response was, none of them and all of them. And I think that response kind of goes along with CAEP and shared signals. Your question was, okay, what do I do with this? It's not so much, it could be used for a single logout. You revoke the session, so I'm going to log you out of everything. I think it's more of a signal telling you that something has gone wrong with this user. Something has happened that right now their trust level has massively dropped. So maybe you take action and maybe you log that person out if you're an access vendor, but you already have, if you are a decently long enough, you have some element of policy or risk internal to your own solution you're offering the customer. And so you pull that information, those events in, and you bake it in. And you say, I'm going to take this action. And when the customer says, why are you going to take that action? You say, well, because of these factors, and I got these signals from this other third party that you told me to trust. And so I'm trusting. And so I'm using all the information I can to make an informed choice. And I really like that idea of not one IDP to rule them all, but you have an estimation and you have an estimation and you have an estimation. And I'll tell you what I know that's relevant, and you can take it and decide what you want to do with it, and then make the best choice after that, right? So I'm not sure we need authorization policy in place to do that. I think a lot of these organizations, a lot of these solutions already have that set up. it would just make that approach better, because risk is always a pretty graph on a UI, but what does that actually mean? And what's the data behind it? There's probably some data science, but you better explain that. I'm getting on a soapbox now, but you better explain that really well. Otherwise, why should I trust you? 87%. Big freaking whoop. Tell me why. Tell me what that means so I can learn from it, so I can adjust my policy, so I can adjust my approach to make things better in the future. Don't just give me a score. And so I think that shared signals and CAEP has a place to push that a little bit, right? To make things a little bit more concrete. But the policy thing, yeah, I think that's a slightly different discussion. I don't know. Shane, Mike, what do y'all think? Man, this is a good discussion.
Shane, any thoughts about do we actually need to improve our authorization level tier in order to use this real-time information? If my app's just doing RBAC and it's using an ID token and creates a session once at login, and that's 99% of the apps out there. Maybe the reason the enterprises aren't seeing value is because there's no way for them to actually build a security model into their application that uses this great new security information. I guess that's my point.
I see what you're saying. Well, so I like what Mike was saying, that it's not about centralizing these decisions. The thing that shared signals gives us is the ability to federate the information, to send it around, to let everybody add their own particular spin to it. Your question about, if the company is just seeing something at the time of authentication, what are they doing with the signal afterwards? It's a reasonable question. And one possible answer goes back to, well, that's not the only time you're ever going to see that user. You're going to see them again and again and again. So let that information inform the next decision that you make. But there are also companies that have more real-time processing or ability to do some real-time things.
Right, and just to make a brief reference back, we did an episode with Aaron Parecki from Okta about a new OAuth spec called for token revocation, global token revocation, and another one also a mention of OAuth status lists to more efficiently publish away expired tokens, sort of like CRL's certificate revocation list for tokens. So I think that there's some thought about how to actually go to the next step. So, okay, we get an event that said the person's logged out. Well, what does that mean? That means we need to revoke these tokens. Okay, but how do we actually tell the RPs that the tokens are revoked? That's where the status list comes in. And then how do those applications actually do anything about it? Well, they better be using some type of advanced authorization tool that allows them to have centrally mandated policies about how to react based upon certain, context or scenario. So I guess what I'm getting at here is that I think I hear so much excitement about CAEP and shared signals rightfully, but I also hear some identity also looking to CAEP and shared signals to be a silver bullet and sort of address this whole problem holistically. Maybe you could address that. Like, where is it? It's targeted. What does it do, or what does it not do?
Right. I agree that it's not a silver bullet on its own. It still requires adoption. So at the end of the day, there are companies that are managing every single access request. Right. They're the websites that you're hitting, the Salesforces of the world. Right. And those companies are the ones that can ultimately stop or allow the access. All the other identity companies are saying, okay, this is who the user is. This is why we're saying that person is allowed to go to Salesforce. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't be saying another company's name on the live stream.
That's fine. No, we talk about vendors here. We're fine. Yeah.
But it's ultimately Salesforce's decision. Do I render this page or not? And so what we need are those companies, the apps themselves, to be receiving these messages and saying, okay, we're gonna stop access. If if Duo said, yeah, that we logged out this user, then we're also going to log out the user. I also want to make sure that this is not 100% focused on that session revoked scenario. There are many other interesting signals that can be sent around, and I think part of the value of this system is that you set up the connection once, and then you have access to all of those signals, and that's what makes it better than just everybody inventing their own logout API, right?
You are right. Yeah, Mike, you are right in that what this is to overload a word. It's another signal to be evaluated in your access model, in your authorization decisions, in your governance, and all along the pathway, right? Whether if you're just doing RBAC and then walking away, well, you've got a lot of issues that we can talk about on a different call, right? Because you need to have a coarse-grained authorization, fine-grained authorization, and all of those have policy all along the way, right? So what this is an additional signal that policy, whether it's authorization policy at admin time with RBAC, or whether it's an SSO, or whether it's fine-grained in Salesforce, like Shane was talking about, they need to incorporate this signal going forward. And what they do with that, how that impacts their policy, it depends. So
birds are coming on. So we try and keep these things on time because I don't feel like no one wants to listen longer than 45 minutes to a live stream. Mike, any last thoughts? I mean, we can't boil the ocean here. So any last thoughts before we break?
I would say that, like any standard, incentives matter, right? Incentives matter for the organizations participating. Incentives matter for the customers who are interested in seeing this stuff happen. This, in my experience so far, when I explain it to customers or to just identity practitioners at large, their instant reaction is, why haven't we already been doing this? Rather than, I don't understand it or I don't need it. So I would say that if you are interested in seeing this standard advance, then contribute. Join the working group and talk to your providers, your vendors, your architects, and say, what are we doing about this? How do we advance this going forward? Because it's not Shane or or anyone else's voices that really will advance it. It's people actually doing identity, saying, we need this. This makes sense, and when can we have it from anybody that's selling you something, really?
Shane, as a guest, you get last thoughts.
Thank you so much for having us on. This is really wonderful. And I just want to encourage folks, like Mike said, join in. Please read the documentation, read sharedsignals.guide for an overview. And this standard it's not that complex. It's fairly easy to implement. And if you're already going to be setting up API endpoints to do things, consider using shared signals, because then you can set it up and then have access to many other signals along the way.
Okay, I like it. Next week, first of all, a quick reminder to audience, please follow Identity Office Hours on LinkedIn. We're trying to get to 1,000 followers. And next week, we have a show on a physical and logical access card. It's something that I always wanted. I always dreamed about a card that had both an RFID antenna that could get me into a building and could be a logical, i.e. a FIDO2 authenticator. It's a really interesting card, and it's a local Austin company, or I guess it's local to me since I'm in Austin, and Mike Kaiser is normally in Austin. So I'm excited about that episode. So thanks guys for joining us, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Thanks everyone.